Please note, rewards offered are subject to change or expire. To the author's knowledge, reward amounts are current and valid as of this episode's air date and may be subject to terms and conditions. Please confirm all reward details with the relevant case authority listed in the show notes. Welcome to Reward Offered. We're back for part 2 of our dive into the mysterious death of Angela Mealing in Cairns in the year 2000. Did she take her life, or did someone else? A reminder, there is a $250,000 reward offered for information in her case and an indemnity from prosecution on the table as well. So if you know something, your information could be worth $250,000 to you. And as long as you weren't the individual who directly took Angela's life, you may be exempt from charges for any part you played in the crime. I'm your host Amanda. Let's dive in. If any of the details of this case cause you distress, please reach out to Lifeline on 13 11 14 in Australia or a relevant crisis support service in your local area. All individuals are presumed innocent until found guilty in a court of law. There is a common adage in homicide investigations that says, every unexpected death should be investigated as a murder until proven otherwise. At a later inquest, a coroner couldn't categorically come to either conclusion between murder or suicide. But before we ever start worrying about possible perpetrators, we need to try and determine which of the two, murder or suicide, the death scene, cause of death, and other factors more closely aligned to. We may not have proof of one or the other, but maybe we can still see which is more likely based on what little we do have. Let's look at the main points of each. If Angela wasn't driven to the location where she is found, whether by Diemel or another individual, she has to walk for up to 1.5 hours, not accounting for any stumbling, in order to get there. What are her risk factors for suicide, and how likely is it that a 17-year-old girl walks 90 minutes along a highway, turns up a dirt road alongside a creek, finds a random slither of rope on the ground, carves a suicide note into a tree without an apparent suitable implement, and manages to fashion a fully functioning noose in one of the weaker surrounding trees, all without any light source, in the middle of the night? A study published online in 2020 in the Medical Journal of Australia looked at a cross-sectional analysis of national coronial data for suicides by young Australians aged 10 to 24 between the years of 2006 and 2015. Let's look at the numbers. Suicide is the leading cause of death for Australians under 25. Of the 3,365 young people included in the analysis who had sadly taken their own lives, 73.5% of them were males. 69.6% of deaths were from hanging or strangulation. 66.6% of all suicides took place in the home. 40.9% had confirmed mental health disorders, and 15.7% were reported as possibly having had mental health disorders. The most commonly recognised disorder was depression. A history of non-fatal self-harm or attempted suicide was reported in 31.1% of cases, including 5.3% falling in the 12 months preceding their death. 26.9% had left suicide notes, while 37.1% had communicated suicidal thoughts to friends or family members prior, and evidence of alcohol consumption near the time of death was indicated in 33.5% of cases. So what crossovers do we have between this data and Angela's case? The implied method is certainly the most common choice for this age group, being hanging or strangulation. We know she had consumed alcohol prior to her death, just as 1/3 of the case studies. And there is an alleged suicide note, although that isn't nearly as common an occurrence as I would have expected, with just over 1/4 usually leaving one. Things that don't align so much. 73.2% had diagnosed or possible mental health disorders or histories of attempted suicide or illicit substance misuse, or had presented to emergency departments for mental health-related events. I haven't seen nor heard anything to indicate Angela ticked any of those boxes, but if you have any knowledge to the contrary, please let me know. 2/3 of the suicides took place at home. Hers didn't. nor have I heard any notion that she ever communicated suicidal thoughts to friends or family, nor self-harmed or attempted suicide in the past. You might say it's a mixed bag of results, but it's complicated by the fact that if someone was hypothetically going to stage a suicide for a 17-year-old girl on the fly, it's not going to be at her home, and your methods are largely restricted if you're trying to achieve believability based on the resources she would have access to. Hanging is likely the most used method for adolescents as it is straightforward in terms of both access to materials and ease of implementation. Yet these are the same reasons why a perpetrator would also likely default to hanging for a staged scene. An instinct might tell you that suicide notes are common, when at least per the mentioned study, they aren't. But you can't write it, and if she's already dead, you can't have her write it. So now you might have to get creative with your method. Somewhat paradoxically, staged crime scenes tend to be disorganised and not very well considered. If we speculate for the moment on a scenario where Demel is in fact the killer, this might explain why you would perhaps clean a vehicle she had been in so thoroughly. While evidence of a young woman in your car is entirely expected and plausible if you simply gave her a lift, I suspect that he probably didn't initially plan on admitting to ever having crossed paths with her, hence cleaning the car. What I can't explain with what we have is why he does just that and admits to having picked her up. According to police, at the time he comes forward, they had no idea where Angela was or who, if anyone, had seen her after she set off alone from the party. In this hypothetical scenario, either he inserts himself into the investigation because his ego can't help but do so, or something has to have made him believe that police were going to be able to link the two of them that night, and him coming forward is an attempt to get ahead of it. What was it that made him think that they were going to be linked? We just don't know. This case has two options. Either Angela Mealing took her own life by suicide, or someone killed her and staged it to look like one. If it was the latter, what signs might indicate a staged scene? A thesis submitted by Claire Ferguson of Bond University here in Australia in 2011 for her PhD was titled "The Defects of the Situation, a Typology of Staged Crime Scenes." She examined staged crime scenes across Australia, USA, Canada, and the UK. She writes, "Staging or simulating a crime scene is one of many precautionary acts offenders may carry out in order to distance themselves from a criminal act. The easiest way to conceptualize the difference between other precautionary acts and staging is to note that where a precautionary act generally involves taking something away or preventing something from being left at the scene, staging involves an attempt to prevent offender identification by depositing or doing something in addition to the criminal act in order to make it appear something has taken place, which is not." She more strictly defines staging as an active attempt to create a scenario or a belief in the investigator which is untrue, without forewarning, regardless of whether or not it is successful. At any time, not just in the instance of murder, where there is any attempt to communicate deception by an individual, the motivational impairment effect is at play, whereby the more motivated a liar is to avoid getting caught, the more likely it becomes that their deception will be discovered, particularly when observers can see or hear their nonverbal behaviours. This can be extended to an offender's ability to deceive through manipulation of a crime scene with regard to physical evidence and may manifest in many ways, such as paradoxical offender behaviour and inconsistencies within the physical evidence. Again, lots of numbers here, so I'll go slow, but this study could prove incredibly relevant and insightful given the core question at the centre of this case is, was it a staged scene or suicide? These statistics might help us identify which one is more likely. Claire's thesis examined 141 cases of staged crime scenes. Findings that might be of interest to us include: of the 141 cases, 12.8% were scenes staged specifically to appear as a suicide. This is the group we'll focus on. It was the second most common staged scene behind burglar or home invasion, which made up 43.3% of stagings. How likely is it that someone staging a crime scene is acting alone? Of the 18 staged suicides in the sample, 15 cases had only one offender, making up 83.3%. Only one had more than one offender, accounting for 5.5%, and 16.7%, being two cases, had an unknown number of offenders. If we apply this to Angela's case, how might this inform our view of the crime scene? With no evidence to indicate any additional perpetrator and statistics supporting a likelihood of one, this can help narrow our options for means and method used to stage the scene itself. Remember the police experiment, of which we have no indication of thoroughness, showing that while possible for Angela to have climbed the tree, tied the noose, and inserted herself into it, they found that it would have been very difficult or impossible for someone else to have carried her up the tree and placed her into a noose. So if one perpetrator can't do it, and we have no evidence at our disposal to indicate a second one, how do we explain the scenario? We can't reconcile the scene. Or can we? Perpetrators usually want to spend as little time at a crime scene with a body as is absolutely necessary. Every additional moment increases your chances of being caught. You have to believe that if this is a staged scene and a perpetrator has no way of knowing how soon the crime scene and body will be discovered, that they staged this scene for a reason. For example, if Angela had been stabbed or shot, and for all you, the perpetrator, know, she could be found tomorrow, staging a suicide hanging would be a complete waste of time because it would be blatantly obvious that her cause of death didn't align with the scene. You would never take on the extra risk required to hang around and stage the scene. But if she was strangled by means of ligature or throttling, which just means manually with your hands, think Homer with Bart Simpson, then you might think you have a good chance of covering up the injuries caused by you with an apparent hanging. That might be worth the additional risk to you. But now you have to get her up the tree, right? Not necessarily. We're told that a clump of Angela's hair and traces of her flesh were found on the noose. That tells us it's highly probable the noose was around her neck at some point, but at least nothing we have conclusively says that that had to have occurred up the tree. Couldn't the noose have been placed around her neck while she's on the ground, either ante or peri-mortem as a means of ligature strangulation, or post-mortem for the purposes of linking her forensically to the noose, and that be how evidence of her makes it onto the rope before it's later hung above her body? Now, I'm not saying that's what happened, just that the notion that the only options to explain evidence of her on the noose in situ are that either A, she climbed up and hung herself, or B, a perpetrator somehow lifted her into position, just isn't exhaustive in my mind. And perhaps police are right. Maybe the rope was simply a fortuitous find amongst the surrounding trash. But that doesn't mean it was Angela that found it and chose to use it. Now, again, it would be super useful to know exactly what of Angela's remains were located, because she obviously wouldn't have sat still while someone put a noose around her neck, so I'm going to assume that she's already deceased at this point, or has at least been rendered unconscious. And lucky for this perpetrator, even if found almost immediately, police would likely find out that she'd already been assaulted that night, multiple times, including blows to the head. So you could likely throw in a couple of extras to knock her out without it standing out significantly as having been unrelated to those incidents. Unless caught completely off guard with a blow to the head, based on what friends and family have said, Angela would not have gone quietly. As morbid as it is, were her hands located? Were any fingernails collected for scrapings? Were any swabs taken from her teeth to see if she'd bitten anyone? And while we're on this point, given Diemel admits he was likely the last one with her, was he ever subjected to a physical examination once he came forward to see if he had any observable injuries? Now, wherever possible, I like to play my own devil's advocate, and in this instance, I have my own critique to myself. If she was never in the noose at a stage scene, and it turned out she was found the next day, that too would have been a pretty useless staging because it wouldn't have explained how she got out of the noose. But on the other hand, while I can't find a definitive answer as to how long it would take for a deceased body to fall through a noose naturally, I seem to have established that A, doesn't always happen. Mummified bodies have been found in situ decades later, still suspended, and B, is highly dependent on what, if any, structural fractures occurred during the fall or attack. So if certain fractures hadn't occurred, and not enough time has passed for sufficient decay to allow her body to fall naturally from the noose, her remains being on the ground could be just as odd if your theory is suicide. Either way, I'm still working on narrowing down this info. Back to the study. Homicides staged as suicides were far more likely to be perpetrated by men, upwards of 83.3%. And because we aren't cherry-picking our information, It was also observed that most of the offenders were not currently or previously involved in law enforcement, which ran counter to one of Clare's hypotheses. This group made up 61%, although this element was unknown or unclear in 33.3% of the cases, which is a statistically significant amount of missing data. It was friendships or acquaintances accounting for 44.4% of relationships between offender and victim in stagings, while perpetrators were strangers to their victims in only 11% of cases. Bank those two numbers. We have no indication that there was any evidence of additional injuries on Angela's remains, so for these purposes we will assume death was from strangulation. And just to clarify, because use of that term can be confusing, strangulation is a broad term used to cover three subcategories: ligature strangulation, manual strangulation, which you'll also see referred to as throttling, or hanging. So by saying she dies from strangulation, we're saying that while we can't define which one, it was one of those three. When it comes to cause of death at staged scenes, ligature strangulations account for 22.2% of deaths, followed by manual strangulation at 11.1%. While in 44% of cases, how the weapon was acquired was unknown, interestingly, it was most often identified, 27.8% of the time, to be entirely opportunistic, perhaps like a rope found on the ground. In 38.9% of these staged scenes, the homicide had taken place during a confrontation. However, in 22.2% of cases, there was reportedly no conflict leading up to the violence. The vast majority of cases, 83.3%, had a weapon arranged at the scene, which in our case would be the noose. Only 2 of the cases, or 11.1%, had a fake suicide note present. Although the method of carving a suicide note into a tree, genuine or otherwise, is so rare, I could find only one other record of such an endeavour. Misao Fujimura was a Japanese philosophy student and poet born in 1886 who carved his farewell poem in the trunk of a tree before taking his own life in 1903 at the age of 16, jumping from the Kigun Falls in Nikko, Japan. Clare's analysis found the victim was rearranged in 2/3 of the cases. This would obviously require extra contact between offender and victim and might result in additional forensic evidence. In the majority of cases, 66.7%, the body was staged at the primary crime scene where the victim was killed. Unexpected, though interestingly, in 77.7% of staged suicides, no alibi was sought out by the offender, perhaps suggesting some degree of arrogance in their own staging abilities. There was an equal spread of cases where a cleanup or evidence destruction occurred and where it didn't, being 44.4% for each. So let's summarise what we can take away from this analysis, specifically for Angela's case. What is statistically the most likely scenario if this is a staged suicide? Angela was more likely to have known or been familiar with her killer than for it to have been a stranger. It was most likely one offender. The weapon was likely an opportunistic find, and the weapon was likely staged. The only finding that would statistically contradict the idea that Angela's scene was staged is the presence of a suicide note. Even a coroner was unable to definitively state Angela's cause of death given the state of her remains, and unfortunately we don't have any idea exactly what sections of her skeleton were recovered. But what sorts of clues might you be looking for when trying to distinguish between suicide or murder at the scene of an apparent hanging? In deaths due to hanging or strangulation, the position, course, and direction of the ligature mark, the kind of knot used, and injuries to the neck structures help in deducing the cause and manner of death. If you've listened to enough true crime, you've likely heard of the strong correlation between hyoid bone fractures and manual strangulation. The exact rates of fracture differ across studies, but hyoid fracture is believed to occur in roughly 50% of all homicides by manual strangulation and 27% of hangings. It's important to be very clear about what statistics are telling us. In the case of the hyoid bone, does every strangulation or hanging result in a fractured hyoid? No. An intact hyoid does not rule out strangulation as an underlying cause of death. But one study from 2016 stated that a fracture of the hyoid bone secondary to a trauma which was other than a form of strangulation, being hanging, ligature, or throttling, is so rare that at that time in 2016, only 31 cases of such had been reported to date in all world literature. So you may be strangled and your hyoid doesn't break, but if you're found with a broken hyoid, even if it isn't what killed you, it is highly likely that you were strangled at some point. While there are numerous studies on neck structure fractures specifically in hanging cases, I found one study in the American Journal of Forensic Medicine and Pathology from March 2012, which was the first to concentrate on the cricoid cartilage as a possible indicator. This was a retrospective study that reviewed and compared 231 cases of suicidal hanging with 4 cases of homicidal hanging and 52 homicidal no-hanging strangulation cases. Okay, so once again, a few numbers here. I'll go slow. Their findings in the suicidal hangings were that overall, neck structure fractures occurred in 54 of the 231 cases, making up 23.4%. However, the cricoid cartilage was intact in all 231 of those suicides. Whereas the general incidence of fractures in the homicidal no-hanging strangulations was much higher at 65.4%, or 34 of the 52 cases, with an incidence of fracture of the cricoid cartilage being 20.6%. Furthermore, when these researchers compiled outside studies from the literature, while they found an incidence of fracture of the cricoid cartilage in homicidal strangulation to range from 5 to 20%, across the 2,700 suicidal hangings analysed, only 1 showed a fracture of the cricoid. So what does this suggest? That the presence of a fracture of the cricoid at the scene of an apparent suicidal hanging should be considered highly suspicious. Cementing this sentiment, other studies found that hangings producing a fractured cricoid could run as low as 0.003% of cases, with some showing an upper range of just 0.5%. So what this is basically indicating is that if the cricoid cartilage was recovered in Angela's case and it is broken, it would be incredibly rare for that to have been a suicide. If you're wondering where the cricoid cartilage is located, this is a really rough map. If you put your thumb and index finger either side of your larynx, about halfway up your neck, and you softly pull your tongue back and down, you will feel a small section of muscle under each finger engaging. These are your cricothyroid muscle. It's also known as the singer's muscle because it alters the tone of your voice and creates forceful speech by stretching and tensing your vocal ligaments. It's a small, bilaterally paired muscle with an anterior arch running up and out laterally before broadening posterior to your airway. Along the base of these 2 angled anterior sections that are under your fingers, running horizontally across your larynx, is the front of the cricoid cartilage. It is the only complete ring of cartilage that encircles our airway and is said to have a shape similar to a signet ring, with the name stemming from the Greek word cricoid, meaning ring-shaped. So our question then becomes, was either the hyoid bone or cricoid cartilage found amongst Angela's remains? And if so, what was their condition? While I couldn't find any solid indication of how long the cricoid cartilage would take to decay post-mortem, I have no reason to believe it would occur within 6 weeks. But someone please reach out and correct me if you know otherwise. There was reportedly over 600 people in attendance at Angela's funeral on the 7th of June 2000. A police escort was said to have led the procession to the Whitewalk crematorium afterwards. As per Reid's book, on the night of Angela's funeral, Adrian Demal was taken to hospital with an alcohol-related illness after collapsing in one of the streets of Cairns. 10 days later, on the 17th of June, following a disciplinary hearing in Brisbane, Demal was officially dismissed from the Queensland Police Service for having lied to investigators in the course of the case. He failed to attend the hearing. June also saw an inquiry into the case by the Queensland Crime Commission. The findings of the commission are not public, but that's not strange, they never are. A coronial inquest commenced on 15th November 2001, with coroner Ken Lynn considering reportedly more than 20 exhibits, including clothing, maps, photos and video footage. But the inquiry was adjourned until April 2002. After the adjournment, a number of individuals, including Coroner Lynn, Bill Isdale, the Crown Solicitor, Detective Senior Sergeant Graham Clark, and Solicitor Ross Norman, who was acting on behalf of Angela's family, all convened at Bahana Creek where her body had been found. Exactly 2 years after her last fateful walk home began, the inquest resumed. Reid reports that day 1 of the inquest saw Detective Graham Clark's discussion of the QPS investigation and Demal's conflicting stories of the night in question. Day 2 saw Demel speak briefly to clarify that he had not been a fully trained officer at the time, merely a probationary officer in training, before claiming privilege and refusing to testify on the grounds that doing so may incriminate him. A witness of particular interest, Senior Sergeant John Cranenberg, a rope expert, had carefully examined the knots on the noose and concluded that a level of knowledge or thought had been put into tying the knots, and that while not particularly sophisticated, he found the mechanism would have performed its purpose, quote, very, very well, end quote, explaining that the noose was tied such that the loop would tighten when pulled. He believed the ability to elicit such a knot would need, quote, a degree of trial and error, good luck, or pre-existing knowledge, end quote, to achieve. While not information we have on hand to consider in Angela's case, research suggests the type and position of the knot plays an important role in the mechanism of death and autopsy findings in hangings. Unlike in this case, ligatures at suicidal hangings are reportedly usually tied in the form of fixed loops, with single knots, but that the knots may be multiple. The position of the knot determines the force exerted on the neck by the ligature, and it will be on the opposite side to the point of suspension. The depth of the ligature mark will be deeper on the side of the neck opposite the knot. Returning to the inquest, Ashley Bearer, who Angela had reportedly been seeing, and who was behind her second known assault on the evening she disappeared, also claimed privilege as Demel had. He did, however, cop to having given police a false story, saying he had been frightened when police first interviewed him as he was doing community service at the time. He said he had initially told police he had taken her to a bus stop, but that was a lie, and she had in fact taken off from the party, as the security footage seems to verify. Then there was the vehicle sighted. Barry Campbell reported having seen what he believed was a red sedan, similar to the one he had later seen in the paper, coming out of the dirt road alongside Bahana Creek as he crossed over the bridge on the Bruce Highway on his way to work late one night. His best estimate was that the event had occurred on or about the 3rd of April. He reportedly started work at midnight, and there is no suggestion that this was on the evening of the 1st into the 2nd, so there's no issue with the timeline and Mealing believed to have been at the party until almost 12:30 a.m. on Sunday. If we assume for the moment this is Demel's red vehicle, the suggestion is presumably that this was him returning to the crime scene on a subsequent night. Mr. Campbell was careful to clarify that he was unable to see anyone inside the vehicle or make out the number plates given the darkness, once again suggesting that many of the activities Angela would have had to perform that night to commit suicide in that manner would have had to have been done with little to no light to assist her. Demel's cousin Audrey testified under oath that she and her niece, I think this is Sasheen? I hope that's right, were with Demel until just before midnight on the evening of the 1st, having accompanied him to his brother Harold's house in Edmonton at 8:30 p.m. to pick up some clothes, and then they returned home. She said they all watched a game of football on television, and Demel had departed the house, she estimated, at approximately 11:45 p.m. on Saturday. This story would be particularly interesting given the purpose of their visit was to pick up clothes. Clothes for who? If it was for either of the girls, could the blue top later found on Angela have been left in Demel's car after that trip and offered to Angela later that night for her to change out of the bloodstained Nike shirt? It's possible. Although I guess there's also no concrete statement saying that the blue shirt found on Angela was believed to be a woman's top. So even if they were collecting clothes for Demel, it could still be relevant. Audrey would also say Demel mentioned to her on the 7th of April, the same day as his second interview with QPS, that he had had dealings with the police in relation to Angela, but mentioned nothing more about the matter. I have to believe that most perpetrators don't tell any more lies or change the truth any more than is necessary, because that requires extra mental load to remember the narrative changes. So as we consider Demel's possible involvement, it's interesting that his account, the third version, of that night and Audrey's differ so much. He doesn't mention that the girls are with him on the trip to his brother's house in Edmonton. He doesn't mention Audrey or her house in the story until after being at his brother's. His story implies most of his time that night is spent at Harold's, and that that's where he watches the footy game. Yet Audrey says they only picked up clothes before immediately heading back and that they watched the game at her house. At face value, it seems that he's trying to remove her presence from the evening's narrative as much as possible. And to be entirely fair, he could have just been trying to distance her from the whole thing, and the discrepancy may mean absolutely nothing. But in any case, it stood out to me. Possibly the only piece of testimony she gave that helped Diemel's case was her claim that no red car had been cleaned at her house in the days following the disappearance of Angela Mealing, although that's contradicted by neighbours. They reported to police that while they didn't know Diemel as the type to clean his car at all, they witnessed him doing just that after Mealing's disappearance, reportedly claiming that they had never seen anyone clean a car that thoroughly. In any case, it could be argued that given Diemel openly admits to Angela having been in his car, and acknowledges that she had blood on both her body and clothes, that it's stranger for police not to be able to find any trace of her just days later when they forensically inspect the vehicle, especially if he hadn't cleaned the car. You might expect to find some blood evidence, maybe hair, fingerprints, particularly on the heavy touch points such as external and internal door handles on the passenger side, the seatbelt itself and the buckle, which would usually be touched by both the left and right hand respectively. The question then becomes, is an absence of evidence in itself? On May 3, 2002, Coroner Lynn delivered his findings into the death of Angela Mealing, handing down an open finding. He stated that although hanging or strangulation was unable to be ruled out as a cause of death, the state of her remains meant a definitive cause of death could not be determined. There remain unanswered questions, and I am not satisfied it was caused by hanging, he said. The coroner found Diemel's statements were unreliable, and that he had not disclosed the whole story of his time with Angela, but acknowledged that there was no evidence any harm had come to Mealing in his car. Coroner Lynn questioned why Diemel had come forward and told so many lies, saying both remained unexplained. He found no indication Angela's state of mind leading up to her death was consistent with an intent to harm herself. He clarified that while evidence suggested that Mealing had been drinking during the night and was what you might call tipsy, there was no indication she was staggering, as was claimed by Diemel. He found the inference to be that Diemel stopped to pick her up for another reason. The coroner labelled the message scribed on the tree as cryptic and found that it had been done using an unknown implement. It could not be determined with certainty that Mealing had carved the message herself, but he did note that the undertaking would have taken a significant amount of time and that it may have been done by Angela if she had indeed still been alive at dawn. I find that interesting. I think that's him also being like, well, how did she see what she was doing? The open finding from Coroner Lynn was bittersweet for Angela's family. They were steadfast in their belief that she hadn't committed suicide, and the findings were clear. There was no proof she had done so, but there also wasn't sufficient evidence to prove that she had died at the hands of someone else, let alone identify them to the degree that they would face charges. The story wasn't over for Diemel, though. On the 16th of July 2005, police revealed that after reviewing Angela's case, they had arrested the former probationary police officer. They had charged him with perjury following misleading information he had given while being questioned during his testimony to the Queensland Crime Commission. Before he could even face a courtroom, Reid writes that Diemel was caught in Cairns behind the wheel of an uninsured, unregistered vehicle with a blood alcohol level of 0.111. He pled guilty to those charges. Adrian Diemel was convicted of perjury by a majority verdict in Brisbane's District Court. He was sentenced to 2 years in jail, suspended after 12 months, so he ended up spending 1 year behind bars. This isn't really relevant to the case at all, but it is a bit odd and somewhat ironic. Diemel actually appears in an ad from 2019 promoting a product for sleep apnea, saying that he has trouble sleeping at night. You couldn't script this. Reid mentions in his book a Channel 9 documentary he was involved in which went to air in December 2004, which covered Angela's case. It was titled Queensland's Unsolved, a Crime Watch special. If anyone has any idea where I could find that or stream it, please let me know, because I've searched high and low, but I've had no luck so far. As stated at the beginning of this podcast, all individuals in this country, and rightly so, are presumed innocent until proven guilty in a court of law. That includes Adrian Diemel. If you're familiar with my work on Lorraine and Wendy's case, you will know that I am all for having conclusive evidence before accusing anyone of anything, but especially murder. Does everything we have considered prove Adrian Diemel was the individual that took Angela's life? Categorically no. There is no physical evidence tying him to her death. No one has come forward saying they saw the pair together such that contradicts Diemel's narrative, any of the versions. But that doesn't negate the fact that there is a lot of holes in his story and a lot of unanswered questions. A 2008 Brisbane Times article released at the time of Dieml's perjury trial seems to cement just how bad the circumstantial evidence against him was, given his claimed version of events. Crown Prosecutor Brad Farr confirmed to the court that footage from the service station on the corner of Riverstone Road and the Bruce Highway showed Dieml's vehicle did not stop or turn off the highway. Quote, "That service station has a security camera system, and one camera is positioned in such a way that passing traffic is caught on tape." End quote. Mr. Farr also revealed that further enhancement and analysis by police had showed a girl in the vehicle matching Angela's description. The article indicated that video surveillance was to be shown to the jury in the coming days and that it would clearly show Dieml's red Toyota Lexus driving past. And while entirely circumstantial and having absolutely no implications of any sort as proof in the death of Angela Mealing, we do know a couple of things for certain when it comes to Adrian Dieml. He has at least 2 convictions relating to violence against a woman, and though charges were later dropped, was at minimum charged for holding a knife to a woman's throat. The last thing I want anyone to do is start thinking black and white, or assuming that there's an obvious conclusion here. But one possibility is that police just don't think they have enough evidence to pursue any charges in relation to Angela's death. The argument being that due to the notion of double jeopardy, you want to be very sure you have an airtight case before pursuing a conviction. That seems to be what Angela's family was led to believe was the predominant issue, and while back in 2002, double jeopardy was certainly a crucial consideration when deciding what cases to pursue to trial. But today, the rules of the game have changed a little. The Criminal Code Double Jeopardy Amendment Act was initially passed in 2007, although it did take another 7 years until 2014 for Queensland to fall in line with the rest of the country and make these changes retroactive. Under Section 678B, the court may order an acquitted person to be retried for the offence of murder if it is satisfied that there is fresh and compelling evidence against the acquitted person in relation to the offence, and in all circumstances, it is in the interest of justice for the order to be made. So it's no longer the case that these are all or nothing situations. It is possible to get another bite at the apple. The question for those working with all the information then becomes, at what point do you just take a run at it and lay it at the feet of a jury or judge to decide what the evidence may or may not indicate beyond a reasonable doubt? March of this year, 2024, saw further reforms to double jeopardy rules in Queensland. Parliament passed new laws to expand double jeopardy exceptions beyond murder to include additional serious offences including manslaughter, attempted murder, and rape. Exceptions include 10 additional offences, 6 unlawful killing offences, and 4 sexual offences. The umbrella of these exceptions will also allow acquitted rapists and pedophiles to be retried should new evidence be found during retesting of forensic samples. On the other side, in the interests of a fair and balanced system, new laws were also passed to provide an additional avenue for convicted persons to appeal. Up to that point, once a convicted person had exhausted their original right of appeal, their only avenue left was to petition the governor for a pardon. However, these new laws establish a right for subsequent appeals on the same grounds of fresh and compelling evidence or new and compelling evidence that a miscarriage of justice has occurred. As of this air date, these 2024 changes are yet to take effect. Based on what I've read on hanging suicides while researching Angela's case, my hackles are up regarding the scene where Angela is found. Combine that with the circumstantial evidence that, look, plain and simple, just doesn't look good for Dieml. His alibi for the evening of April 1st into April 2nd ends at 11:45 p.m, some 35 minutes before Angela is last seen by someone who isn't him. He admits to picking her up and her being in his vehicle with blood all over her, yet a forensic analysis of the car just days later finds zero trace of her. He says he drops her off at a location where it is 100% verified he didn't. And the last place his vehicle is seen heading is south in the direction of where Angela's body would later be found, with what Crown prosecutors would say video enhancement shows to be a girl matching Angela's description in the passenger's seat. He then claims he didn't realise that the same 17-year-old girl he was actively participating in a police search for was the same one for which he had supplied alcohol to and spent hours in the presence of just a couple of nights prior. I understand that lots of people don't like circumstantial cases, but I suspect Kelly Siegler would find this one a pretty damn good starting point. Also interesting, the house where Diemel's alibi ends at 11:45 p.m. is in the same suburb as the Cairns Golf Club, where he says that he picks her up from. It's a 5-minute drive. Another point that stood out to me. Why on earth does Diemel go back to Audrey's house early on Sunday morning to sleep on the couch, when he'd hired a hotel room the day before with a perfectly good bed, and checkout wouldn't have been until at least 10 a.m.? This man who claimed that it wasn't until after participating in the search for Angela and his memory being pricked by a description of her clothing that he suddenly realised the girl he had been with was one and the same? Objectively unlikely. And one might query why Angela might have felt comfortable getting into the vehicle with Diemel. Perhaps because she knew him. His niece was a good friend of Angela's, and Angela was often at the same house that forms part of Diemel's narrative that evening, the house at Edmonton, where Diemel's brother lived. Look, we have to be careful not to become assumptive. You have to evaluate everything we've discussed for precisely what it is. Things can look ridiculously suspicious, and that is still not in any way proof of anything. But if there was ever a case where you could say that the tiniest piece of information could start the snowball rolling, guys, this is it. Has Diemel or anyone else made admissions to anyone out there about being involved? Maybe while under the influence. Does someone recognize the description of a 3-buttoned sky blue collarless shirt? Did you know someone who had a shirt that matched that description, or know where it might have come from? Did you see any persons or vehicles in the vicinity of Bahana Creek around the time in question? I've been told there is many of you out there that did see just that, but the police didn't follow up with you. If that's you, please reach out. This next one is a little more targeted. I know there is girls out there who are around Angie's age who might have information regarding a separate event that might be relevant to this case and what happened to Angie. You know what I'm talking about. Please reach out to me at rewardofferedpod@gmail.com. Everything is confidential. No one will ever know we spoke. If you have any information that you even remotely believe might be relevant to the events of April 1st, 2000, come forward. If you have information relevant to Adrian Diemel, come forward. Or if you have any information relevant to another individual, also come forward. If you aren't comfortable speaking to police, share it with us, or I can put you in touch with Angela's family directly and you can share your information with them. Or you can call Crime Stoppers on 1-800-333-000. There is still currently a $250,000 reward offered in Angela's case, and you can share your information with Crime Stoppers entirely anonymously and still claim the reward. And please, if you have tried to share information in the past and it was never acted on, or you were never contacted, please reach out to me. So many people are living with the aftermath of decisions made that night. Some made by themselves, some made by others. Stuck in this riptide of what-ifs, made more difficult because it's they themselves who won't release them from the waves of regret. Could one small change have made all the difference for Angela? Maybe. Maybe not. It's easy to point out where people's actions or inactions could have changed the events that night, and it's entirely justifiable and understandable to direct anger towards those people. But I think it's important to remember that some of those people were just children, and that even turning 18 doesn't magically imbue us with maturity or rationality. I've spoken to many people who would change their actions and decisions that night. But please remember that ultimately, if Angela didn't take her own life, the only one responsible for her no longer being with us is the person who did. That's it for this one, kids. Socials are reward_offered. Thank you for tuning in. It means, at this point, everything. If you get any value from my work, it would mean so much if you could take the time to leave 5 stars wherever you listen. I'll love you till the end of time if you leave a review. Please share the episode, particularly if you live in North Queensland. If you live in Cairns, this is you. Share it amongst your local Facebook community because those are the ears we need to hit. I plan to keep working on Angela's case, so again, please reach out, rewardofferedpod@gmail.com if you have anything that you think is useful to add. Sadly, Angela's mum has already passed on without a resolution, and the rest of her family, including her brother, are just left wondering. Not knowing cruelly leaves loved ones in limbo. So if it's more information police need, let's get it for them. Catch you on the next dive. Thanks for listening.